Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going today to speak about biodiversity and perception of alterity. So our relationship with the natural world is diversified and complex, and we have many different interactions with the other organisms. For instance, we can have interaction for feed purpose, to hunt them, to use them as a transportation modality, for clothes, to ensure our security, for advertisement, region, prestige, and so on. But our relationship to the other organisms has also a very strong emotional component. For the other organisms, we can feel affection, fears, joy, disgust, curiosity, and so on. This emotion can be very intense and diversified, even for a given species. For instance, some people may feel affection for a cow, some other will fear admiration or fears. And also, we can be totally indifferent from an emotional perspective to the other organisms and to the cows. It's important also to take into consideration the taxonomic variation of these emotions. Some species will more frequently involve bad feelings like fears or disgust, whereas other species might more likely involve positive emotions like admiration or affection. Sometimes these emotions can even lead to very weird reaction from human, especially when we apply a very anthropomorphic obsession on these organisms, as you can see here on these very weird pictures. Also, the emotions toward the other species may have a strong political and social repercussion. For instance, here on this advertisements provided to boycott the use of palm oil, or on this one, it's from a French vegan association promoting veganism, or in this exhibition where you can see people fighting against vivisection and scientific experimentation on animals. You can see that the message is not only how can I say, argumentative. It's not only speaking to the reason, it's also moving our affects. The goal of this message, and especially the pictures, are intended to involve emotions in our mind. And about the strong consequences of these emotions, you can see that sometimes it can be strong from a societal point of view, because Chris Filardi, which is a biodiversity scientist working in the US, published a couple of years ago a picture of birds collected, I think it's in the Solomon Islands. It's a rare species of kingfisher, and he collected this specimen, and of course with authorization in a legal way. And he explained that he was very proud of having collected this specimen because it was the first male present deposited in a collection. And following this tweet, there was a petition requiring him to put him in jail, whereas he is just, as you and me, a biodiversity scientist, and he is obviously not collecting a hunting trophy. That's not the idea. So this to say that emotions are a very strong phenomenon. The phenomenon of emotions is most often under-considered by our community of biologists, because most often we tend to consider that emotions are related to sentimentalism, that they are something in the field of human sciences, that they are somehow opposed to the reason, because it's very old. It's goes back to the antiquity, where there is an opposition. In one side, the reason, that is the normal way of thinking, whereas on the other hand, the emotions would be a kind of pollution disrupting our mind. Whether it is true or not, we mostly know since the development of the cognitive biology in the 50s, that actually emotions are totally a part of us. And they are driving our behavior far more than our reason do. Even when we believe that we do something for a good reason, actually behind it, we are guided most often by our emotions. So obviously, science do not define values, do not define what is good or bad, fair or unfair, beautiful or ugly. It has not to justify if an emotion is appropriate or not. But science can, and I would say must, study the emotions, what provoke them, what are the underlying mechanisms. Because actually we are animals and our emotions are the product of the evolution. So the emotions are fully part of us as a species. So what makes our preferences across species? Why we love some species and why we don't love other species? We know since a long time now that different criteria can be considered. We usually prefer young over old animals. We prefer when they are vulnerable, either rare or fragile. We have more affect for the species that we consider to be beautiful, and especially when there is a resemblance with human. So in these pictures showing a tiger and a baby orangutan, you can see two young animals. Both are vulnerable. Both are considered as more or less beautiful, and for sure there is a very sharp resemblance between an orangutan and a human. So thanks to this mixture of characteristics, I'm pretty sure that most of us will find these two guys super cute. And it is important also to consider that our taxonomic preferences are biasing also our community, the work of our community. I mean that even the community of the biodiversity scientists is deeply influenced by these taxonomic preferences. And for instance, I guess it's not totally a coincidence if I'm studying vertebrates and not invertebrates or algae or mushrooms. Actually, the question of emotion is fundamentally an evolutionary question. And there is this quote of Darwin that I like a lot, because it shows that he already had a very sharp intuition. Darwin wrote in 1871, "Sympathy beyond the confines of man, that is, humanity to the lower animals, seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. This virtue, one of the noblest with which man is endowed, seems to arise incidentally from our sympathies becoming more tender and more widely diffused until they are extended to all sentient beings." This sentence is quite nice because it shows that first, our sympathies were likely, above all, intraspecific, and somehow they diffused to other organisms, but probably in a second time. So it's a cue to understand, to explain maybe the next part of this presentation. So now let's speak about the studies published in 2019, which is based on an online study that took part in 1 year above, in 2018. So this online study was called Biodiversity and Perception of Alterity, and involved many participants online, thanks to a website devoted to this study. The goal was to draw an affective map of the living world and to interpret it within an evolutionary analytical framework. So now let's describe the tests. The empathy refers to our ability to connect to other emotion. It's a kind of intuitive understanding of the emotion of another. Whereas the compassion refers to the feeling of concern for another with the motivation to remedy to it. So this can be summarized like this. For the empathy, it's more like, I understand that you are suffering. Whereas for the compassion, it's more like, I feel your suffering and it affects me and I would like to help you. So just to really get the distinction between both notions, a psychopath or a sadistic person may feel empathy. He may feel what you are feeling and he may like to feel that you are suffering. But for sure, this guy has not compassion. This difference is important to get. So to study our empathic perception of the biodiversity, we used a phylogenetic and anthropocentric approach. So it's an exception. I mean, of course, usually when we are doing phylogenetics, we are hating anthropocentrist approach, but here it's a bit different because the phylogenetic perception from our own perspective.
Mal termino o projeto, já me manda workshop aqui, caralho.
Sorry?
Mal terminei o negócio, meu orientador me manda uma conferência.
Rafael, desliga o microfone.
Okay, I continue. So here you have, for instance, not for instance, it's a phylogeny that is showing the sampling that we used. So to get a good phylogenetic diversity relative to us, we have selected 24 sister clades that are connected to the lineage that are leading to the human. So we have the chimp, the gorilla, the orangutan, and so on, and protostomians, so insects, and the fungi and the plants. We have excluded all the microscopic organisms because they are out of our sensory reach. We cannot see them, and only 200 years ago, we didn't know that they existed. The second criteria, we managed to take as much as possible the diversity among each of these clades. So for some species with a very poor diversity, such as the chimp, the gorilla, the pongo, we took only a single species. But for this hyperdiverse group, like the protostomian, we sampled different species. We have, for instance, up to 8 species in protostomian with earthworm, seashell, cephalopods, insects, and so on. The third criteria was to take into consideration the diversity within each species. So for each species, we took 4 pictures because individuals are variable and also each pictures may give a different impression of an animal. So with 4 pictures, we consider it was more diversified and preferable. In total, we had approximately 50 species represented by 200 pictures from ranging from humans to plants. And this is the divergence time estimated in a million years. And so this is an example of the set of pictures we had. And for human, we had 2 men and 2 women representing 4 distinct phenotypic ethnies. Then after, so we did an online questionnaire and we received different participants, and they had to answer 2 different questions. The first one was intended to quantify the empathic preferences. So the question was, I feel I am better at understanding the emotion of, then the participant, the online participant, had to make a choice. And we repeated this procedure 22 times with pictures that were randomly sorted. To quantify the compassionate preferences, we used the same protocol, but with a different question. If these 2 individuals were in danger, I would spare in priority the life of, then again, you have to choose the species that you prefer. And I have to mention also that we did 3 repetitions to ensure the consistency of the answers. So that if a participant don't give the same answer for the same question, that means that he is not very reliable. We also provided an individual questionnaire to get some information, personal information about the participants, such as sex, age, the knowledge about the biodiversity, weak, medium, good, very good, the diet, if the guys has pets and which kind of pets, the opinion about hunting or fishing, pro, cons, or neutral, and also a question about the absolute value of the life of an animal. So an animal has no value, an animal has a weak value, the importance of an animal, the life of an animal, so is important, but is less equal or superior to a human life. In the end, we managed to get more than expected with 3,500 participants. All of them have not been analyzed because about 1,300 participation have been excluded, either because their IP address was repeated. So maybe it's different person in the same family, but maybe it's the same person that repeated the test. So we keep only one participation per address IP. We have excluded the few French people. The questionnaire was written in French, and we excluded it for consistency, but also because we were not sure that the people correctly understood the questions. And we removed the non-reliable participation. I mean, those was the replicates where the incorrect replicates were more than one. We removed the incomplete tests, and also when the response time was too long or too short. And in the end, we get 2,347 participation, around 1,000 for the empathy questionnaire, and around 1,000 for the compassion questionnaire. So now the results. The results have been published in this paper in Scientific Reports now 2 years ago. And they show that empathy and compassion toward other species decrease with the evolutionary divergence time. So, sorry, it's in French, but here, this is the curve showing the empathy score. And here, this is the phylogenetic distance separating from us. So you see it's gradually decrease, and then it reaches a minimal level, which is approximately stable. And concerning the compassion, the results are relatively similar, although the slope is maybe a bit less sharp. Here, this is the detailed results. So each dot is representing a score for a species. The full dots represent the empathy score, and the white dots represent the compassion scores. So first, we can see that the difference is not a difference of nature, the difference between the different species. There is no difference of nature, but it's rather a difference of degree. I mean that, for instance, we don't see the dichotomy, the opposition, for instance, between this traditional categorization of life, which are opposing us, human, from the rest of the life. This is, for instance, the case in religion or in humanism, where we consider that humans are a kind of something apart. But we can also see that there is no opposition very clear in our perception between the tetrapods and the fish. Like, for instance, in the pesco-vegetarianism applied for ethical reason, where people accept to eat fish, but not accept to eat tetrapods. We can also see that there is no such a barrier or such a dichotomy between vertebrates and invertebrates. We know, for instance, that there are different systems of regulation intended to guarantee the welfare of animals. That makes this dichotomy. The laws, the rules intended to regulate the animal welfare are most often focusing on vertebrates, but not in invertebrates. And we can also see that there is no differences in terms of perception between the animals and the plants, like in the different philosophy, like the anti-specism or the vegetarianism for ethical reason. So in the end, it's just a gradient. There is no such a thing as a dichotomy or barrier between fundamental group. So how to explain this gradient? The most likely explanation, and actually it's the only one we have, relies on what we call the anthropomorphic stimuli hypothesis. The principle is rather simple. The more we are close to a species from a phylogenetic point of view, the more we are sharing common traits, synapomorphisms, with this species. And the more these organisms look like human, the more they are human from a human perspective, from the point of view of the stimulus. And the more we perceive them as alter ego, and the more our neuronal circuitry is able to stimulate the prosocial reaction that are usually at work in our intraspecific relationship, and this prosocial reaction are usually beneficial for our relationship. So here, this is the same graph, and you can see that probably after a certain time of divergence, the different score reach the lowest level for empathy. So it's the mean per clade, this score. And probably this lowest level corresponds to the most basic signal, anthropomorphic signal, which correspond to the recognition of entity to be alive. So after a certain time, we have no more preference for tunicate, cnidarias, fungus, or plants. It's really the minimal level, but it's not zero. What is interesting is where is located the break in the curve. Here you can see that it's decreased very progressively. Then after such a level, it becomes stable. It stabilized at the minimum level. It roughly corresponds to the apparition of the bilaterian. So I will skip this part. For empathy and compassion, it's more or less the same. So here we have the bilaterian species, and here the non-bilaterian species. The bilaterian species are characterized by a bilateral symmetry. So they have a head and a tail, a ventral and a dorsal side, and a left and a right side. And this bilateral symmetry allows us to structure our anatomy, and it's kind of frame that allow us to make homology between us and another organism. When I see another bilaterian, I know where is his tail, where is his head. I know what an eye, I know that this is a mouse, an eye, and so on. Whereas in the other organisms, the non-bilaterian, it's not possible. And this hypothesis is reinforced by the fact that here we have two groups of animals that are actually not bilaterian from a phylogenetic point of view. They are truly bilaterians, but they have lost secondarily the visible bilaterality. For instance, the echinoderms, like the sea star, or we also have the tunicate that looks like nothing. It's kind of bag. There is no head and so on. And for these organisms, we have a very low level of empathy and compassion. What is interesting is to report the number of species per clade, per group, and to compare them with the empathy score. And if we do that, we realize that we have empathy and compassion, a significant empathy and compassion for only vertebrates, more or less, or let's say bilaterian, which represents less than 1% of the life on Earth. And whereas for 99% of the life on Earth, we have the lowest level of empathy. So This is certainly not a very good news from a conservation point of view. So now let's speak about the differences observed between the compassion and the empathy. So here, this is a graph that shows you the correlation between the empathy and the compassion. You can see that both are obviously well correlated, although not perfectly. The slope is a bit weaker in this direction. But globally, the animals that receive a high compassion have a high empathy score have a high compassion score, and reciprocally, those that have a relatively lower empathy score have a low compassion score, and all these scores are correlated with the phylogenetic time of divergence from us. So this is another graph that says more or less the same thing. Sorry, but we can see on this graph that the slope is more pronounced for the empathy than for the compassion. You see, for these organisms, the empathy is lower than the compassion, whereas here, the empathy is higher than the compassion. There is another difference, is that for few species only, compassion is not correlated with empathy, nor with divergence time. So the weird stuff comes from the compassion, not from the empathy. For instance, here, there is a very clear deficit of compassion for the ticks. It's not very surprising, but it's more than a very low score of compassion. It's more like a true aversion. We hate ticks and we want they die when we ask the question, which one I'm going to save. Because if we would be totally indifferent to the tick, it would be somewhere here. And there is another species, it's a bit weird, it's the oak tree. It has an excess of compassion. So I can understand that we like a lot a tree and that we prefer to save a tree than another animal, why not? But what I cannot understand is why the oak has a high empathy score, because I think it's very difficult to guess the emotion and the feeling of a tree. But this is my point of view. And just to show you, this guy, the orangutan, has the highest score in empathy and the highest score in compassion. That means that the orangutan has a higher score than human. Among the other differences, there are few differences related to the personal knowledge and ethical value. And it's more pronounced for the compassion than for the empathy. The compassion, the personal knowledge and the personal experience is more influencing the results than the empathy. And another difference relies on the fact that the response time is higher for compassion. It's almost always 1.5 seconds more to answer a question than to answer a question dealing with compassion than the answer dealing with empathy. So that means that there is more hesitation. It's less spontaneous. This can be explained, all these phenomena can be explained or are contributing to explain the fact that the empathy is morally neutral. It's so the question can be, the answer can be very spontaneous. It's morally neutral because the question is just asking to the participants for which one do they feel more able to feel an emotion. Whereas the compassion questionnaire was intended to be a moral dilemma, because that means that if I am saving one species, I am indirectly causing the death of the other. So it's moving the effects somehow. So what happens in the mind of the people that fill this questionnaire? Probably first, when they have compassion question asked, first they use their empathic perception. It's a kind of a very intuitive feeling that we have. And this empathic impulse is structuring our compassionate response, because we see that they are deeply correlated. But not only, because on the other side, we have the knowledge, our ethical conviction, our ethical preferences that are also modulating our compassionate impulse. But in the end, it's always the compassionate impulse and the empathic perception that are winning, because it's just a bit modulating the final answer. So to say this otherwise, when people are doing a choice, a compassionate choice, when they have to choose which one they want to save, there are two things in their mind. The first one is the following question: the death of which one of these two individuals affects me the most? And there is another question, another philosophical issue is the death, which one of these two individuals deserve the most to survive? And you see, it's not the same thing. It's the first one is really affective, and the second one is more rational. And probably there is a balance between both, but in the end, it's the affect that is winning, that is more important, apparently, than the reason. So now this question highlights several questions, and I have no answer to this one, but it highlights a very weird fact is our ability to have altruistic interspecific behavior toward other species, and it might look like a paradox from an evolutionary point of view. For instance, in the world, we are spending more than 70 billions of dollars every year for pets, for dogs, cats, and so on. And just as a comparison, the World Fund to fight against AIDS, paludisms, and tuberculosis, it's 14 billions of dollars. And it causes 3 million of deaths per year. So from a pure strategic point of view, our species is not investing the money on the right place, from a strictly Darwinian point of view. And somehow it evokes me similarities with niche brooding, you know, the cuckoos that is taking profits of the emotional behavior of another species to parasite it, and the other species can take profit of this other species. So this is the negative interpretation of these results, but there are also other questions. For instance, maybe the empathy may have been an advantage for our species. Empathy may have, for instance, helped our ancestors to anticipate an animal reaction, to feel intuitively its mood. And for instance, maybe these very brave hunters used empathy to perceive a risk, a danger facing a predator, or to anticipate the reaction of a prey, or to maybe our ancestors may have been using empathy to detect an issue with the cattle. You can feel if an animal is sick or whatever. And our compassionate impulse also may have been providing advantages for our species. For instance, our ancestors may have probably been able to feel the distress or the pain of another animal. Maybe our ancestors have been pushed to rescue, to help, to adopt, to feed a baby wolf or whatever, and maybe this behavior has contributed to domesticate the dog. For instance, what do we know about the cognitive predisposition our ancestors had when they domesticated the dog? Why they did that? Why they did that? And how? We don't know. And interestingly, we are not eating dogs, and the dogs, despite of that, was the first of the animals that have been domesticated. And now we present it as our best friend. So now I consider that this study is just opening a door, and I would like to continue on this issue. And in the coming year, I'm going to work on 2 different projects in the continuity of this study. The first one, if I can travel, it's not easy now because of the COVID, of course, but I would like to test if these empathic perceptions are really universal, if they are characterizing us as a species, to say this otherwise, if they unite us, yeah, as a species, if it's not a matter of culture, because all the participants were French. So to do that, I am planning to add new data set and to repeat these experiments in French Guyana, in going to Wayana, Kalina, and Bushimingue villages, so that I can repeat the same test with them. So they are hunter-gatherer in the Amazonian forest, and to repeat also the same test in 2 different populations, the Fang and the Baka in Gabon. And to do this, I will take profit of colleagues of mine that are anthropologists and that are working in the museum and that are used to work with this population. And there is another aspect that I would like to develop. Actually, I already have the results, but I am working on their interpretation. I would like also to develop the cognitivist approach and to redo the tests to investigate on the effect of neurodiversity on our empathic predisposition toward the rest of the life. And I repeated the tests with the help of 200 people presenting autism spectrum disorder. So autism, as you know, is a neurodevelopmental condition that is attenuating different skills related to empathic perception in these people, which make them more difficult to establish harmonious relationship with others, because it's more difficult for them to really get the emotion and the feeling, to really get the mental state of another, and what make them life sometimes quite difficult. And this is linked to a deficit in empathy, and the results we obtain are quite interesting, but given that they are not totally analyzed, I'm not going to speak more about it. And I think I finished my presentation for today, and maybe I will have the opportunity to complete this presentation in 1 or 2 years later. I thank you very much.